Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, Armenia and Azerbaijan, North and South Korea, China and Taiwan. These aren't just neighboring countries. They're the flashpoints on today's map, the conflicts raging right now as you watch this video. If this list makes you think the world's gone mad, you're right, just haven't yet realized how mad. Because the fractures in the world we once knew run deeper than they seem. In 2023, there were 183 regional conflicts, an absolute record for the past 3 decades, for a period already steeped in bloodshed. Sanctions as a tool to pressure aggressors aren't new either. If you track their use, you'll see a surge in the 1960s, acceleration in the 1990s, and a skyrocket surge in 2012, 2 years before Russia became a champion of getting sanctions for annexing Crimea. Back in 2014, when the first sanctions package against Russia was imposed, the global economy barely flinched. And today, the world is just mired in sanctions, with everyone being against everyone and the emerging trade wars only worsening the situation. On screen, you can see just how much the US profits from tariffs on foreign imports. The US isn't just closing itself off economically, it's building physical walls too, and it's not alone. October 2016, Hungarian voters overwhelmingly reject refugee resettlement, 98% against and just 2% in favor. In Germany, a radical anti-migrant party AfD has doubled its support in a very short time. And then there's the case of the UK with its Brexit, fueled by frustration with Brussels' bureaucracy and migration spikes, finalized in 2020. In May of that same year, India's PM Modi launched his famous program,
Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan,
or Self-Reliant India, a nationalist slogan to serve as an impetus to boost domestic production. Is what we were told for so many years about globalization just a hoax? This doesn't exactly feel like friendship is magic, you know? That's the point. Events like Brexit, Trump's resurgence, the AfD's rise, and global tensions aren't merging the world, they're splintering it into more isolated blocks. How did we end up with an American citizen being unable to buy a Chinese EV, while Chinese citizens can't import French cognac? And why is half the world's airspace closed to so many airlines? There's a reason. Please, meet Deglobalization. "65%. That's the level of globalization we live with today. Now, what does this number mean exactly? Excuse me my brief history lesson. Until a certain point in human history, trade between states was mostly closed. In other words, no trade beyond borders. One reason being a contraption called Stone Club. Oh, come on, by that point they already had clocks, water wheels, even used Archimedes' screw to get the water out the ground. Alright, sure, but we're talking about an era when people didn't know the Earth was, well, is, round. Well, frankly speaking, some still don't.
I don't believe in a round Earth, 'cause I'm a flat earther.
Forget the Earth, most lived not realizing that settlements existed beyond the nearest mountain. Then, in the 2nd century BCE, the world order was shaken when Chinese diplomat Zhang Qian opened a route linking east and west for millennia. You know what I mean, the Silk Road. Not just silk, in fact. China exported a whole plethora of then most posh goods to Europe: porcelain, mirrors, metals. Europe was sending back wool, leather, jewels. Who would have thought this route would, 1,000 years later, deliver paper-making technology to Europe, fueling its information revolution, though some scholars argue Europe paid for it with the Atra Mors, aka the Black Death, an export from Asia. Some things never change, eh? Yet the Silk Road can't be thought of as the globalization we know today. Luxury goods like silk and porcelain served only elites. Their macroeconomic value was basically negligible. Yes, those lucky few who kept the trade on the Grand Silk Road grew insanely rich, only if they weren't robbed or killed first. By the 7th century, this became a common occurrence when the Turkic Kaghanate, the Silk Road's main overseer and beneficiary, collapsed into warring states. Traders now had to pay off multiple factions instead of one, with each demanding tribute. A refusal would lead to loss of cargo or life. Strife between the remnants of the empire didn't help either. As land trade faltered, where do you think merchants had to turn? If you've watched our videos, you know 90% of global trade now happens by sea, but that's now. We've got 1,200 years of history to cover first. Around this time, as the overland Silk Road became mired in feuds between local warlords, another Silk Road began to emerge, this time a maritime one. By the 15th century, European Christians controlled nearly all global sea trade. And here's how their trade network looked like. The Black and Mediterranean seas were their cash cow, steadily milked right until 1453, when the Ottoman Empire captured Christianity's greatest city, Constantinople, thus cutting off Christian trade routes both above and below Constantinople, a city you now know by a different name, Istanbul. These events threw the Europeans' plans into disarray, but they quickly regrouped. With Muslim blades waiting for them in the east, their exploration turned westward. In 1487, the Portuguese, led by Bartolomeu Dias, circumnavigated the African continent, opening a new sea route from Europe to India. Just 5 years later, another explorer searching for India, Christopher Columbus from the Republic of Genoa, sailing under a Spanish flag, set course to the west. He made landfall on shores previously not known, dubbed the local inhabitants Indians, and sailed back home quite pleased with his discovery of India. But a decade later, Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, while studying South America, made a realization. That wasn't India that Columbus found, but rather lands entirely unfamiliar to Europe. Still, no one bothered to rename the Indians, so they kept their misnomer. This period in European history, by the way, came to be known as the Age of Discovery. Thanks to these explorations, the known world for Europeans suddenly expanded sixfold, and it still turned out larger than anyone realized. Australia was unlocked in 1606, in 1642 New Zealand, and in 1778 James Cook unlocked the location of the Hawaiian Islands. And so, European nations established global supply chains. Only at this point can we definitively say the economy had truly gone global. One teeny tiny warning, though. Yeah, what Europeans actually established across these new lands was a colony metropole system, or, to put it bluntly, a classic case of the strong exploiting the weak. Take Spain, for example. From its colonies in Mexico and Peru, it looked to extract vast quantities of gold and silver. These precious metals flowed back to the motherland, where they financed the production of goods, which were then shipped right back and sold to those very same colonies. Remember the Portuguese? They turned Brazil into their sugarcane plantation. Naturally, it was Portugal that dictated all the terms, from pricing to trade conditions. In one of our previous episodes, you can recall how Britain created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, unilaterally set favorable prices for themselves and ultimately triggered massive civil unrest across the country. And I bet you've heard plenty enough about Britain's colonial empire crown jewel, India. True, trade was indeed becoming global at this stage, but in a way that's coercive and lopsided. And while you might call this outright plunder, the esteemed gentlemen of the era preferred to call it trade exemptions. It's the colonial era, fueled further by the discovery of new lands to exploit for cheap sources, that gave rise to an economic system whose consequences remain hotly contested. But no one disputes its impact more fiercely than those who first bore the crushing weight of capitalism. Portugal and Spain began to drain Mexico and Peru of their gold and silver. Massive flows of precious metals, essentially pure wealth, came flooding into Europe. Let's look at the numbers. This was Europe's precious metal output before the age of exploration, and this after. The result? 4 times increase. Wait a minute, aren't you comparing medieval Europeans to an early modern societies? It makes sense that 16th to 17th century production got more advanced. Fair enough, and we should also count population growth, but the real driver behind this explosive growth was still a systematic plunder of conquered lands' natural resources. Take silver, for example, the most crucial metal of that era. This much came from European mines, and this is how much was liberated from American colonies. This triggered unprecedented price shocks, so extraordinary for the time they were dubbed the Price Revolution. Here we see a familiar picture: peasants and artisans getting the short end of the stick in a form of inflation, while factory owners and merchant elites took advantage of it. A fascinating domino effect. Muslims conquer Constantinople, forcing Europeans to go westward. They discover indigenous people and establish colonies. The colonies become cash cows, making Europeans rich. These riches are used to progress further in their technological tree. In a way, Constantinople's fall set in motion the Industrial Revolution, which then catapulted forward the very globalization we live with today. And it's at this moment we arrive at a concept of a great power. What is globalization? The way I see it, it's reducing the sense of scale. First, we find out there are neighbors just beyond the nearest mountain. Then came overland routes, sea routes, railroads, air travel. Each breakthrough had broadened the world in our eyes, at the same time, paradoxically, collapsed it. The real acceleration came in the 19th century when humanity unleashed the Industrial Revolutions to full scale. Steamships were free from weather's whims, leaving wind-powered vessels in their wake. The telegraph shrank continents by transmitting messages across vast distances. Locomotives hauling heavier loads farther and faster than horse-drawn transport ever could. The more we grasped Earth's scale with technology, the smaller our world became. Britain emerged as the global elite's vanguard. Its vast colonial holdings provided endless cheap resources, while the dominant Royal Navy served as the ultimate diplomatic weapon. For example, when Britain blocked all Iranian oil sales, shocking Italian buyers who were ready to purchase it. When the Italian tanker Rose Mary tried to leave an Iranian port, it was intercepted by the British Royal Navy and escorted to where it needed to go. This news changed everything. Already by 1850, Britain, with just 2% of the world's population, was producing half of all manufactured goods globally. It's worth saying that it's exactly the 19th century that saw international trade volumes growth peak. They went 30-fold in just 100 years, and only the beginning of World War I managed to put an end to this golden age. As trade expanded, marginal costs kept dropping, and shipping rates fell even faster. The early 20th century created the first truly global consumer. Over a century ago, a chap from London already could have telephone-ordered goods from anywhere in the world. Middle-class citizens now accessed luxuries that would have been unthinkable even for monarchs of past eras. Keep in mind that the successors of the Age of Discovery, such as Britain and France, hadn't by then exhausted their colonies' potential. In fact, they were still establishing new ones. Most globalizing and industrialized European nations grabbed for a piece of Africa, and by 1900, the only independent country left on the continent was Ethiopia. The article also shows how most nations didn't have these opportunities. Without access to technology or capital, and with industrial powers refusing to share, they had no choice. After Germany and Italy had their unifications, they naturally sought entry to British and French markets and, just as naturally, faced resistance from the established powers. This tension became one of World War I's catalysts. I'm sure history buffs might debate me in the comments. Look, what matters is this: during both world wars, globalization went into a reverse. Allies turned rivals, coming up with new rules for a new world order. These forces drove global trade's share from 30% to just 10% by World War II's end, a 100-year regression. The post-World War II era launched a second wave of globalization, aided by cars and planes. Maybe that explains why, as early as the 1930s, Hitler, Volkswagen's chief patron, put such an emphasis on auto industry. The world's true masters are not reptilian overlords, probably, but the top industrial powers controlling the markets. In the 18th to 19th centuries, Britain steered this ship. Post-1945, we all know, the USA took the wheel. By 1945, the United States dominated global manufacturing, producing over half the world's goods. With more than one-third of global exports, the war-torn Europe also left them an extra bonus: 2/3 of the planet's gold reserves. The sudden onset of this new position of economic power presented the United States with a number of new responsibilities. The actions of American leaders would no longer only affect citizens in the United States. Such actions proved to have long-reaching repercussions across the globe. And so emerged a new great power, a fact proudly displayed at New Orleans' World War II Museum. The official American narrative cites 3 factors: the pound's decline, war, and decolonization's blow to Britain's image, which ushered in America's dominance.
Watch it, girl. There's a new sheriff in town.
Meanwhile, global trade rose back up like a torrent, hitting new records with 40% of the world's GDP by the early 1980s. The new formula was straight, strict, and simple. No exports means you're obsolete. Globalization's last great leap forward came with the socialist bloc's collapse. Dozens of new nations joined the global market, pushing trade's share from 40% to 60% of GDP by the 1990s. Just think about it. 2/3 of everything countries produced was now traded across borders. Numbers. What do they mean? Can we even see the real impact? Absolutely! The first wave of globalization ran on steamships and telegraphs. The second wave rode automobiles and planes. The new millennia welcomed internet as its ultimate engine. Now R&D could happen in one country, manufacturing in another, and global sales anywhere else. Take the iconic iPhone 5. Designed in California, rare earth minerals mined in Mongolia, LCD screens from Japan, microchips made in Korea and Taiwan, gyroscopes engineered in Europe, all that then gets assembled in China and shipped to 100+ countries. You know, this wasn't just about iPhones. Globalization has touched everything everywhere, raising our living standards. This time without exploitation playing a major role. The World Bank reports in 25 years since the 90s, global extreme poverty rates plummeted from 35% to 10%. So here we are in the modern age. Cheaper goods, new opportunities, and the highest living standards in human history. By the way, we also have a whole episode on this too. But globalization's latest cycle has run its course. The rules are being rewritten as we speak, just like a century ago. Last 200 years, it felt as if humanity had only one thing on its mind, expanding their trade reach as far as they could beyond their borders. Look at the timeline on the screen. Industrialization and global trade in the 19th century, then world wars rewrite century-old rules, Britain's hegemony fades, and America takes charge. At the end of the 20th century, basically every nation trades with everyone. Even in the 21st century, when we look at the beginning, countries kept expanding their mutual economic relations in pursuit of profit. Until 2008, that is. The crash brought a reckoning. Is this increasing interdependence worth the risk? The system came with strings attached. If you trade, you depend, and dependence is a thing nations fear most. Like in our iPhone example, only made possible by globalization, suppliers and manufacturers are sourced globally and the product is sold worldwide. Today, everyone in the world competes to be the best iPhone assemblers. It's not colonies or gold reserves that makes you a winner these days, but knowing how to produce better, faster, and more. We live in a reality where the world is one giant marketplace, basically. And the once backward nations today are taking bites out of the so-called civilized world's pie. And oh, you know well how they do it. Industrial might. Take, for example, Volkswagen, the world's top automaker. These two cars share identical production technology and components, yet one costs €57,000, while the other's priced at just €30,000. Because the former is made in Germany and the latter is made in China. Geography equals cost. And now this industrial titan plans factory closures, unthinkable a generation ago. Sure, the decision has been delayed for now, but the mere fact this discussion even takes place marks a seismic shift. 30 years ago, the idea of behind-times Chinese firms acquiring cutting-edge Volkswagen's facilities would have been laughable, if not absurd. Take BASF Corporation. This is not just a fly-by-night operation, but the world's largest chemical producer. We've covered how this industry literally puts food on our tables in a recent video. Now, this titan of industry decided that it's better to close a total of 11 factories in its homestead, Germany, and relocate them to, yes, you guessed it, China. One's loss, others gain. Germany will have fewer manufacturing jobs, and China will get a surging demand for skilled labor. This isn't just capital flight. Jobs, lives, and livelihoods are moving wholesale. Do you wish to know which Western politician fights hardest against this exodus of jobs? An ambitious KGB recruit known as Comrade Krasnov. Never heard of him? Well, you might know him by his other name. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States. Let's hear it from the man himself.
We will bring back our jobs. I'm going to bring back millions of jobs. I will bring back jobs.
These slogans propelled Trump to the White House in 2016 by resonating with working-class Americans who felt abandoned and left behind by their government. You all know the iconic
Make America great again.
or MAGA, but how does he plan to restore that greatness? By bringing jobs back home, pure and simple. Wait, what? Bring them back from where? People are leaving the US now. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm telling you is China is raping the USA.
Like what? What?
And no, I haven't lost my mind. Like so many other absurd comments, these words came straight from Trump himself. And he first said them 9 years ago.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
Workers leave and return, countries rape each other. What in the hell is happening? Trump's definition of rape, you mean? A trade deficit. Trade, trade, trade. We've been all over this word the entire video. Remember how I said trade creates dependency? Imagine a country A sells $50 million to a country B, while a country B sells $100 million to a country A. That means country A has a trade deficit, and country B enjoys a surplus, and with it, leverage. This imbalance creates dependence, and dependence creates risk. Country B could weaponize its advantage in electronics, oil, metals, whatever its specialty may be, to pressure country A at a crucial moment. We even have terms for these kinds of power plays. Energy diplomacy, specifically gas and oil diplomacy. China even got its own version. Railway diplomacy. But there's a second, more insidious risk. When we import cheaper, better goods, we stop making them ourselves, losing the skills, industry, and jobs of our own workers. This is the violence Trump rails against. This is the logic behind his trade wars.
China, 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 China.
How significant can be this violence that he protests against? Here are the exact figures. In 2016, the United States sold goods worth $116 billion to China and bought Chinese goods for a total of $463 billion. US trade deficit, $347 billion. 2 years later, this imbalance grows to a record $419 billion, but surprisingly, by 2024, it stands at approximately $300 billion. Which, when adjusted for 12 years of inflation, actually falls below 2012 levels. Yet even this reduction represents a massive shortfall. Those $300 billion in imported goods could have been manufactured in America. This is China, as we heard, stealing American jobs. The scale of trade violence becomes clear when we look at the data. Over a 17-year period, nearly 4 million US jobs were specifically lost due to trade with China. The hardest hit states were California, Texas, and New York. Breaking it down by sector, and we see 1.5 million job loss in electronics manufacturing, while steel and aluminium imports cost the US 400,000 positions in metallurgy. Indeed, these numbers do appear alarming at first glance. However, we must consider several factors. There's no guarantee those imported goods would have been instead produced domestically. The figures represent hypothetical scenarios without proven direct causation from China trade. Other factors like automation and efficiency gains also contribute to layoffs and cuts. Ultimately, what we're seeing are potential opportunities being lost rather than definitive theft, a theoretical economic argument and not a settled fact. Having said that, I do find the administration's core argument having some merit. Cheap, high-quality imports increase consumer surplus in the short run, letting people buy cheaper cars or phones and other products. But for domestic industry, the long-term consequences spell trouble, as citizens would struggle to find jobs producing goods competitive in both domestic and foreign markets. Have your economy depend on selling just one commodity, especially if it's a natural resource? Don't develop alternatives and domestic economy, and you'll manufacture a catastrophe when the market tides shift. To be precise, there is one region that didn't get anything good out of this new cycle. This one. Of its 45 nations, 42 run trade deficits, in some cases as high as 35% of GDP. These are staggering numbers, particularly when contrasted with simultaneous growth elsewhere. This isn't to say the sub-Saharan region got no future, it sure does, but taken in comparison, it consistently fares worse than other developing areas. Global poverty rates have plunged dramatically since 1990, from 35% to just 10%. But averages can be deceiving. For every story of success, there is a story of failure. Sub-Saharan Africa made progress, yes, improving from 54% to 41% when it comes to extreme poverty, yet compare that to East Asia and the Pacific, where rates collapsed from 60% to an astonishing 3% in just 3 decades. China being the star performer, naturally, although Indonesia, Thailand and Vietnam deserve credit too. South Asia also delivered impressive gains, cutting poverty from 50% down to 20%, with population giants India and Pakistan plus Nepal and Bangladesh in the standouts. Here's a nice-looking GIF. Take a look. Whole Asia turns from deep red to white and yellow, from destitution to relative comfort. These regions were colonies once, or fell under spheres of influence, then became destinations for cheap labor outsourcing. But over time, the factories and technologies that were carried over there slowly catalyzed development to an extent that no one anymore would call them backwards. Today, they've become manufacturing powerhouses while we've become their primary customers. Globalization, turbocharged by Western nations for decades, has begun backfiring on its architects. Where Europeans once flooded colonies with their goods, they now find themselves on the receiving end, and now their own markets are oversaturated with foreign products. Now you see why the long-dormant protectionist policies are being brought back into the spotlight. But protectionism isn't just about defense. Done right, it's meant to actively pressure domestic industry to develop. You've probably heard just how aggressively the current US administration pushes exporters to reshore production. And after 2022, the structure of competition also changed. Take a look at Russia's case. In 2008, the Renault-Nissan alliance entered the market by acquiring a controlling stake in Avtovaz, the Soviet-era automaker, injecting life into the dying giant. For over a decade, this joint venture competed locally against manufacturers from Korea, Japan, France, and others. But after the alliance's withdrawal, Russia's auto industry was left to compete internally only with her eastern neighbor, China, and, well, more China. Electric vehicle war has hit Europe just as well. In October 2023, the EU launched an investigation into Chinese EVs, which predictably resulted in, who would have thought it, protective tariffs. The fears are simple. European automakers won't be able to withstand the cutthroat competition. Interestingly enough, a while back in 2013, the EU had already slapped tariffs on a different Chinese import, solar panels, after a European Commission spokesperson stated, Chinese companies are selling solar panels to Europe at far below their normal market value, which causes significant harm to EU solar panel producers. But completely cutting trade ties with China is basically impossible. The EU imports 500 billion worth of Chinese goods, running a nearly 300 billion deficit, itself quite comparable to America's. Remember those leverage points we discussed? China's got the leverage. Donald Trump made dealing with China a centerpiece of his agenda, launching his, first trade war in 2018. It began with 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, to which China responded in kind, mirroring the measures. Then came new US tariffs, this time targeting $16 billion worth of goods. China again fired back. This tit-for-tat exchange of restrictions, with trade barriers being passed around as a proverbial ball, gave us what we now call trade wars. But if these sluggish trade spats no longer surprised anyone, early 2025 left the world astonished. Seemingly out of the blue, US started picking fights not just with China, but everyone, both friend and foe, and the motive is the same as always: trying for better deals in a market where supply growth long has outpaced demand. For those familiar with North American trade, though, Trump's moves weren't too unexpected. Since 1994, NAFTA had bound the US, Mexico, and Canada in a simplified EU-style free trade zone, dismantling tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Critics warned it incentivized moving production from expensive America of the US to cheap America, aka Mexico. So guess how President Trump felt about that arrangement?
Your husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. And now
he first floated this back in 2016. By 2020, he'd scrapped NAFTA and replaced it with USMCA, hailing it as a historic win for the American blue-collar worker. The old deal was a total disaster, he claimed, while the new one would create 600,000 jobs, with a carefully added disclaimer: potentially. Whether that potential ever materialized? Well, story for another day. What lies at the core of the problem is simple yet surprising. The world today produces too much. Global supply has ballooned and quality imports threaten local industries everywhere. Suddenly, US tariffs on Canadian aluminium don't seem so groundless, do they? After all, the first tariffs hit back in 2018, although Canada and Mexico got exempted back then. Old allies got a pass, and America still could afford to be picky. 7 years go by and everything changes. Supply outgrown all expectations and markets hit saturation point. There's no new territory to colonize. I don't know, maybe the moon? Competition boiled down to tech and price, and when foreign cars, electronics, or steel flood your market, what else can you do except protectionism? Old alliances rearrange, new trade deals are signed, political realities bend to market realities. What we're seeing is nothing less than a global market carve-up. As Trump once said, "Steel is steel. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country." To survive, nations selectively deglobalize, shielding key sectors to build competitiveness. Free market? That's tomorrow's problem. Share this with anyone who hasn't figured out yet how we all went global. See you next time. And I'm the researcher.